Ms. Sherizaan Minwalla, you are a lawyer and also for the human rights, and you work actively to study the different aspects of gender-based violence and being activist and being here for almost a decade working with different international NGOs. You have come across some observation during humanitarian response with the survivor of GBV. Can you tell us your experience about this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's such an honor to be on a panel with such an amazing group of women who I've admired for years. I'd like to talk a little bit today about the issue of documenting conflict-related sexual violence. So I was here during the ISIS genocide, and I did a lot of work with Yazidi survivors. And you know, there's a lot of important reasons why we want to document atrocities. For example, the media tells these stories to raise awareness around the world so that people will respond, so that help will come to the region and help the survivors. Investigators document this information for accountability reasons, for prosecutions in the future. Human rights advocates document conflict-related sexual violence as part of the services they provide. So there's many reasons why we do this, but one of the problems is that when we document gender-based violence and sexual violence in a way that is unethical, we can cause harm to the victims and survivors. So one of the things, well, there's a few things that I observed after 2014. When women and girls were escaping from Daesh, many of them were being pressured to tell their stories in the camps, and many of them were being asked to tell their stories over and over again. So some women were saying that they told their story to 15 or 20 different journalists. And as someone who works with victims and survivors of GBV, I knew that this was problematic because it's traumatizing to have to recount your story. And it raised questions about informed consent. So you can ask someone whether or not they want to tell their story, and they can say yes or no. But if you don't tell them how their information will be used, where it will appear, whether it will stay online forever, whether you have permission to show their name and face, you know, all of these issues, then you haven't really obtained meaningful consent from the survivor. So in 2016, I undertook research with a colleague of mine who's a sociologist, and we said, you know what we think is the problem. Let's see what Yazidi women think. And so we did a research project where we interviewed 26 Yazidi women. 13 of them were survivors. We did not ask anyone if they were a survivor. It just happened that half of our sample were survivors. We didn't ask them about what happened in captivity. Our question was, what was your experience in engaging with the media when they gathered stories and when they reported on what happened to you? How did you feel about that? So I want to share with you 5 findings that came out of that research. The first one is that a number of women said that they felt pressured to speak to the media. They felt pressured by journalists themselves. Some journalists lied to them. Some of them misled them. Some of them said, this will be good for you. Some of them said they were pressured by camp managers. Some of them said they were pressured by members of their own community. This raises a lot of questions, again, about informed consent, because when someone tells their story, it should always be fully voluntary. The second finding was that women suffered intense emotional pain when they talked about traumatic experiences. So, as Dr. Nazar said, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a psychologist. I could not evaluate the psychological impact of the way that these women were interviewed. But what they did say is that we suffered in telling these stories. They would break down crying. Sometimes they would faint. They would have difficulty sleeping. So these are all indications that it was a very difficult experience for them to tell their stories. I just want to give you a couple of quotes because I think it's most compelling when you hear what the women say. So one woman said, it is difficult. When they come here, each time we tell them our stories, we go back to them like a flashback. We go back again to ISIS. I remember everything. We have flashbacks. They remind us of what happened to us again. It's difficult, and sometimes when we're sitting with our family and children, I have a pain in my heart, and I tell them, please, enough, I cannot talk about that, don't remind me. That suggests that these individuals were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and when you have a flashback, what that means is you are reliving your trauma again. You are not in the tent in a camp. you are back with ISIS in your mind. So this is very dangerous in terms of people's well-being. The third finding is that women reported that despite this pain and hardship, they felt it was worthwhile to talk to the media. 75% of the women we spoke with said they wanted to talk to the media. Why? They wanted to help their community. They wanted people to help rescue their relatives from captivity. They wanted to return to their place of origin. They wanted humanitarian assistance. So they were willing to suffer, and they realized that their stories had value. Because there were many atrocities, as we know, in the Yazidi genocide, but the one story that the media wanted to report on was the one involving sexual violence. So that was their currency. And so 31% of women did report positive feelings after speaking with the media. And that also suggests that, they can have a positive experience when these interviews are done well. The fourth finding is that women expressed feelings of frustration, anger, and betrayal. Why? Because they told their stories over and over again, and so many of them told their stories, but they didn't feel like they got what they were hoping for, right? Their relatives back from captivity, returning to their homes. 61% of the women we surveyed said that they were frustrated with the international or global response. And then the fifth finding, and this is really concerning, I mean, they all are, but in the fifth finding, the journalists undermined personal safety of the survivors and their relatives. How? Many of these stories publish names, faces, and other identifying information of the survivors. So everyone knows who the survivors are. It's out there. And we know that conservative society, there are issues of stigma and shame, whether we like it or not, whether they're accepted back or not. This is the reality for survivors of sexual violence. And they also had relatives in captivity. So one of the women we interviewed said, I faced retaliation when my relative escaped and spoke to the media and her identity was exposed. They beat us. Another woman said, and this is really important, many of the images you see of Yazidi women, they have a scarf covering their face but not their eyes. And I asked the women, do you feel like this protects your anonymity? And she said, with photos, even with my face covered, I did not feel safe. They know everything about me. They can know me from my eyes. Even I know them when they are covered. So that really tells us that we need to be careful. We need to listen to the women, and we need to put their safety and well-being at the center of the response, because all of this work is to help them. And if we're hurting the survivors in the process of helping them, then something is wrong and something needs to change. I just want to end by saying there has been some really important progress. So codes and guidelines on ethically reporting on gender-based violence, they do exist. The Global Protection Cluster had guidelines at the time we did our research, but nobody was using them. Since then, more and more organizations have started to develop codes that are really useful. So one is the Murad Code, which is named after Nadia Murad, the survivor and Nobel Prize winner. That code is intended to be a global code of minimum standards for documenting conflict-related sexual violence across different disciplines and across different contexts. The draft code is available in Arabic and English. It's online. And a revised code will be available early in 2022. And then another really useful code for the media.
Sherizaan, can you make it in 1 minute, please?
This is my last point. The EU DART Center for Journalism has a really good code that they recently developed for the media when reporting on conflict-related sexual violence. And then there are others. So I just want to say there has really been progress in terms of responding to this issue, but if the codes just sit on the internet and we don't use them, then it's not going to have an impact. So we really need to start, taking action and learning about those and incorporating them into our work.
Coming back to your study, what was the most harmful response that the woman found it or reported? It was a media coverage or it was the interviews? I want the audience to know this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, 85% of the women reported at least one violation from the Global Protection Cluster guidelines. I think the most dangerous violation was the one where people's identities were exposed, and then that put them at risk of shame and stigmatization themselves, but also their relatives in captivity at risk. And not just relatives, people from their village, so anyone associated with them.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Suzan Khan, براست